In the quiet, fog-filled streets of San Francisco, where the Bay Bridge gleams in the distance and life seems serene, no one could have predicted the nightmare about to unfold. It began like any other love story. Susan Verona, the woman with a dazzling smile and infectious warmth, had captured Emanuel Verona's heart. To the outside world, they were perfect. But beneath the surface of this picturesque romance lurked a secret so dark that it would lead to one of the most gruesome murders in the city's history. Emanuel, a hard-working and devout man, had built a life of stability. He worked long hours as a foreman at a major construction company, priding himself on his integrity and his devotion to his wife. At 34 years old, he was the kind of man friends relied on, someone who lived by the old-fashioned values of honesty and loyalty. And when he met Susan, a beauty with striking green eyes and a captivating laugh, he believed he had found his soulmate. They met through friends at a church charity event, and it wasn't long before they became the it couple everyone admired. But as the saying goes, appearances can be deceiving, and this picture-perfect life was built on a foundation of lies. From the outside, their life in a quaint San Francisco neighborhood looked like a fairy tale. Weekends spent at local cafes, evenings taking in views of the Golden Gate Bridge, and an ever-growing circle of friends. Emanuel had fallen fast and hard for Susan, marrying her in a grand ceremony within just a year of meeting. Yet, as anyone who knew them would later recount, there was always something slightly off about Susan's guardedness, a flicker of hesitation behind her beautiful smile. For months, Emanuel ignored the signs, the late-night phone calls, the sudden and unexplained trips into the city, the growing distance between them. He couldn't place it, but something was eating away at their relationship. Every time he questioned her, Susan reassured him, using her natural charm to deflect the unease that gnawed at him. But deep down, Emanuel knew she was hiding something. He just didn't know what. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a chilly Friday evening in November. Susan had told Emanuel she'd be working late at her boutique salon, but Emanuel, sensing something was wrong, decided to surprise her with dinner. His heart sank as he arrived at the salon to find it closed, its windows dark. Panic set in. Susan wasn't there, and she hadn't been there for hours. He drove home, his mind racing with possibilities, but nothing could have prepared him for what he would discover when he got there. The moment he walked into their apartment, Emanuel felt something was off. It was too quiet, too still. And then he noticed the faint light seeping from their bedroom. His heart pounded in his chest as he entered the room, only to find a small, inconspicuous box sitting on the floor of their closet, a box he had never seen before. His hands shook as he opened it, and the moment he saw its contents, the world around him shattered. Inside were documents he could barely comprehend: medical records, legal forms, and a birth certificate. But it was the name on the birth certificate that stopped him cold: Elijah Carter. Susan had been born male. She had kept this from him for their entire relationship, for their entire marriage. Emanuel's blood turned to ice as the betrayal hit him like a freight train. His wife, the woman he had vowed to spend his life with, had lied about the most fundamental truth of who she was. He felt the room spin, his vision blurring as a tidal wave of anger, confusion, and devastation crashed over him. When Susan returned home that night, Emanuel was waiting. "What is this?" His voice was barely a whisper, trembling with fury as he held the documents in his hand. Susan froze in the doorway, her face draining of color as she saw what he had discovered. She had always feared this moment, but the look in Emanuel's eyes, the mixture of heartbreak and rage, was something she could never have imagined. "Emanuel, I can explain," Susan began, her voice cracking. "I wanted to tell you I did, but I was scared. I love you, and I didn't want to lose you." Emanuel's voice grew louder, filled with a pain so raw it cut through the room like a blade. "You've been lying to me this whole time. Everything we've built, it's all a lie." His hands trembled as he threw the papers at her feet. "Who are you, Susan?" "No, who were you?" Tears streamed down Susan's face, but her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Emanuel couldn't hear her over the deafening roar of betrayal ringing in his ears. He had built his life around her, trusted her, loved her. And now, it all felt like a cruel joke. The argument escalated. Emanuel's anger was like a storm, uncontrollable, destructive, and growing more dangerous by the second. Susan pleaded with him to calm down, to listen. but the rage had already consumed him. He couldn't see the woman he loved standing in front of him anymore, only the lies that had poisoned their marriage. In a fit of blind fury, Emanuel stormed into the kitchen. His eyes locked onto a hammer sitting on the counter, the tool he had used so many times in his work, now taking on a far more sinister purpose. Susan's pleas turned to screams as Emanuel approached her, hammer in hand, his eyes wild with a rage she had never seen before. "No, Emanuel, please. We can talk about this," but it was too late. The first blow landed with a sickening thud, and then another. Susan fell to the floor, her cries for mercy drowned out by the sound of Emanuel's violent assault. The man who had once promised to love her forever now stood over her, consumed by an uncontrollable, murderous rage. By the time it was over, the room was a scene of unimaginable horror. Blood splattered across the walls, the floor soaked in red. Susan's body lay motionless, barely recognizable from the brutal beating. But Emanuel wasn't done. He dragged her lifeless body to the bathroom, his mind spiraling further into madness. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen drawer and began to mutilate her body, cutting her beyond recognition, as if trying to erase the woman he had loved from existence. Hours passed before Emanuel finally stopped. Exhausted, covered in blood, he sank to the floor beside what was left of Susan's body. In the silence of that bathroom, the gravity of what he had done began to settle in. He had murdered the woman he loved, the woman who had lied to him, but whom he couldn't let go of. In a daze, he grabbed his phone and dialed 911. "I killed her," he whispered, his voice hollow and devoid of emotion. The operator tried to keep him on the line, but Emanuel could barely comprehend what had just happened. His life, their life, was over. When the police arrived, they found Emanuel sitting on the bathroom floor, his hands stained with blood, his eyes vacant and distant. The scene was so gruesome that even the most seasoned detectives were shaken. Susan's body was mutilated beyond recognition, and the walls of their once happy home were now a grotesque canvas of violence. The trial that followed gripped the city of San Francisco, making headlines across the nation. Emanuel's defense team argued that he had been pushed to the brink by Susan's deception, that he had acted out of a moment of extreme emotional distress. But the prosecution painted a far darker picture: a man who had allowed his insecurities and rage to turn him into a cold-blooded killer. In the end, the jury found Emanuel guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, his once bright future now nothing more than a dark and tragic memory. But for the people of San Francisco, and for the friends and family who had once admired Susan and Emanuel, the scars of this crime would linger for years to come. A love story that had started with so much promise had ended in unimaginable horror, leaving behind only questions, heartbreak, and a warning of how far betrayal and anger can spiral out of control. The nightmare was over, but the memory of Susan Verona and the violent end she met at the hands of the man she loved would haunt the city forever. The gruesome details of the case sent shockwaves through San Francisco. News vans lined the quiet streets of their neighborhood, journalists scrambling to capture every angle of the horrific crime that had shattered the peace of their seemingly perfect community. The trial was all anyone could talk about. How could a man so loved, so respected, commit such an unspeakable act? But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered even more unsettling truths about Emanuel Verona and the life he shared with Susan. The couple who had appeared to have it all, the love, the success, the future, were living a life filled with lies, mistrust, and secrets too dangerous to stay buried. The prosecution worked to paint a picture of Emanuel as a man consumed by his own fears and insecurities, someone who could not handle the truth when it came crashing down on him. His rage, they argued, was not an isolated incident, but the result of years of pressure and internal conflict. But what made the case even more shocking were the testimonies from those closest to the couple. Friends and family were called to the stand, and the courtroom fell into an eerie silence as they revealed cracks in the Verona's marriage that no one had ever seen coming. Emanuel's co-workers, who had always admired his work ethic and loyalty, described a man who had grown increasingly withdrawn and agitated in the months leading up to the murder. They had noticed his temper flare more easily, his usually calm demeanor giving way to bouts of frustration. But the real shock came when Susan's close friends spoke. Many had noticed her distancing herself from Emanuel, and while she had never revealed the full extent of her past, Those who knew her could sense that something was weighing heavily on her mind. One friend recalled a conversation just days before the murder where Susan had seemed anxious, hinting that she was hiding something important from Emanuel, something she feared would change everything. She was terrified, her friend had said on the stand, tears welling in her eyes. I think she knew what was coming, but she didn't know how to stop it. She loved him, but she was living in fear of what would happen if he ever found out. And find out he did. As the courtroom was shown evidence from the crime scene photos of the blood-stained walls, the hammer Emanuel had used, and the knife that had mutilated Susan beyond recognition, there was a collective gasp from the jury and those in attendance. The brutality of the crime, the sheer savagery of the attack, was something none of them could have prepared for. But what sent the trial into a spiral of even more intense emotion was the day Susan's family took the stand. Her mother, an older woman with a face etched in grief, spoke about the pain of losing her daughter in such a horrific way. She revealed that Susan had always struggled with the fear of being rejected for who she truly was, that her decision to transition was something she had fought for her entire life. But more than anything, she spoke of her daughter's desire to be loved and accepted for who she was. She wanted to tell him, her mother said, her voice breaking. But she was so scared, she thought he wouldn't love her anymore. And now, she's gone because of that fear. The jury watched, some with tears in their eyes, as the weight of those words sank in. This wasn't just a case of murder, it was a case about identity, trust, and the devastating consequences that can occur when the truth is hidden for too long. As the trial neared its conclusion, Emanuel took the stand. His once strong, confident appearance was gone, replaced by a man broken by his own actions. He admitted that he had loved Susan deeply, but that discovering the truth about her past had sent him into a spiral he couldn't control. His voice trembled as he described the moment he found the documents, the birth certificate, the medical records, and how everything he thought he knew about his wife had been ripped away in an instant. I wasn't thinking, Emanuel said, his eyes hollow and filled with regret. I felt like everything was a lie, and I lost control. I loved her, but in that moment, I couldn't see anything but betrayal. The defense argued that Emanuel's actions were the result of extreme emotional distress, that the discovery of Susan's secret had triggered something inside him that led to his horrific actions. But the prosecution maintained that no amount of betrayal could justify the level of violence Emanuel had inflicted on his wife. The jury deliberated for days, the weight of their decision heavy in the air. And when they returned with their verdict guilty of first-degree murder, there was a palpable sense of finality in the courtroom. Emanuel Verona, once a man admired and respected, was now a convicted murderer, sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the story didn't end there. The aftermath of the trial left lasting scars, not just on those who knew the Veronas, but on the entire city of San Francisco. The gruesome details of the murder, the revelations about Susan's hidden life, and the violent rage that had consumed Emanuel were all too much for some to comprehend. The media had a field day, spinning the story in every direction, from tabloid headlines about betrayal to deep investigative pieces on the dangers of hidden identities. For Susan's family, there would be no real closure. Their daughter was gone, and the pain of her death was something they would carry for the rest of their lives. They had lost a woman who had fought so hard to be true to herself, only to be taken away by the very person she had trusted the most. And for Emanuel, now serving a life sentence, the weight of his actions would haunt him forever. He had destroyed the one thing he loved most in the world, and now, behind the bars of his prison cell, he would spend the rest of his life grappling with the horror of what he had done. San Francisco would never forget the tragic story of Emanuel and Susan Verona. It was a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lie beneath even the most beautiful love stories, and how quickly lives can be torn apart when the truth is buried too deep. The nightmare had ended, but the memory of what happened in that quiet San Francisco neighborhood would linger, a permanent scar on the city's soul. And as the sun set over the Golden Gate Bridge, casting long shadows across the streets, one thing remained clear: this was not just a story about murder, it was a story about love, lies, and the devastating consequences of a truth too dangerous to reveal. The shockwaves of Susan Verona's brutal murder didn't just ripple through the Verona family, it tore through the heart of San Francisco. The once peaceful and affluent neighborhood was now the scene of one of the most sensational crimes the city had ever seen. Neighbors, who had once waved to Emanuel and Susan as they walked their dog or attended local events, were now grappling with the horrifying reality that such a monstrous act had unfolded in the home next door. But the real terror lay in the layers of betrayal that had built up over time, creating a pressure cooker waiting to explode. The whispers of Susan's past, the hidden life she had lived before she met Emanuel, were now the centerpiece of a citywide conversation. The murder had become more than a tragic killing. It had become a flashpoint for debates on identity, trust, and the dangers of secrets. As the media descended on the case, details that had once been kept in the shadows were now on full display. The documents that Emanuel had found, the truth about Susan's transition, and the violent way he had reacted, these elements turned a private tragedy into a public spectacle. But the public was divided. Many sympathized with Susan, seeing her as a victim not just of Emanuel's brutality, but of a society that still forced people like her to hide who they truly were. Others, disturbingly, framed Emanuel as the wronged party, a man pushed to the edge by a revelation too shocking for him to bear. But the deeper truth, the one that remained buried beneath all the headlines and speculation, was that Emanuel had always been a man teetering on the brink of control. The facade of a perfect husband, a loving partner, had long masked the insecurities and fears that had plagued him for years. Friends who had once admired his dedication and devotion now spoke of the signs they had missed: the small bursts of anger, the increasing distance in his relationship with Susan, and the way his emotions always seemed just barely in check. In the weeks leading up to the murder, those closest to Emanuel noticed a shift in his behavior. He had become more withdrawn, more suspicious of those around him. His co-workers recalled his quiet but growing frustration, his mind seemingly elsewhere during work hours. It was clear now that Emanuel had been battling inner demons long before that fateful night, demons that ultimately consumed him when he discovered Susan's secret. Susan's side of the story, however, was one of fear, love, and desperation. She had spent her entire life hiding parts of herself, terrified of what the truth might bring. When she met Emanuel, she thought she had finally found someone who could love her for who she was, even if he didn't know the whole story yet. But as their relationship deepened, the fear of losing him grew stronger, and so did the walls she built around herself. Her friends, who took the stand during the trial, painted a picture of a woman who had lived with the weight of her secret for far too long. They described Susan as loving, warm, and generous, but also as someone constantly afraid of being found out. One friend recounted a conversation where Susan had confided her fears about Emanuel finding out, how she had wrestled with the idea of telling him but was too scared of losing him. She wanted to tell him, her friend said tearfully, but she didn't know how. She loved him so much, but she was afraid he'd leave her, or worse. That fear had kept Susan silent, but in the end, it was that very silence that sealed her fate. As the trial unfolded, the jury was shown gruesome evidence from the crime scene: photos of the blood-soaked walls, the hammer Emanuel had used in his frenzied attack, and the mutilated remains of the woman he had once promised to love and protect. The courtroom was hushed, the air thick with tension as the brutal reality of Emanuel's actions was laid bare for all to see. But the true horror wasn't just in the violence, it was in the cold, calculated way Emanuel had tried to cover his tracks afterward. Investigators revealed that after the murder, Emanuel had meticulously cleaned parts of the house, attempting to hide the bloodstains and remove any evidence that might link him to the crime. He had even tried to stage Susan's body to make it look like an accident, a desperate attempt to avoid the consequences of his actions. But the evidence was overwhelming. The police had arrived too quickly, catching Emanuel before he could fully erase the traces of his brutality. And when confronted with the reality of what he had done, the once confident, composed Emanuel had broken down, his mind fracturing under the weight of his guilt. As the closing arguments were made, the prosecution hammered home the point that this wasn't a crime of passion, it was a cold-blooded murder fueled by anger, betrayal, and an inability to accept the truth. They painted Emanuel as a man who had always been in control, until he lost that control in the most horrific way possible. The defense, meanwhile, tried to humanize Emanuel, arguing that he had been pushed to the edge by a revelation that had shattered his world. They claimed that he had acted out of emotional distress, that his actions, while horrific, were the result of a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by the shock of discovering Susan's past. But the jury wasn't swayed. After days of deliberation, they returned with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole, a decision that brought a sense of closure to Susan's family but left a lingering question in the minds of many. Could this tragedy have been avoided if only the truth had been revealed sooner? The aftermath of the case left a deep scar on the city of San Francisco. The Veronas had once been the picture of a perfect couple, but beneath that facade lay a darkness that no one could have imagined. The story of Emanuel and Susan Verona became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of secrets, the destructive power of lies, and the devastating consequences when love turns to hate. As Susan's family tried to move on, they were left with the haunting memory of a daughter who had fought so hard to live her truth, only to be taken away by the very person she had trusted the most. And for Emanuel, now serving a life sentence, the weight of his actions would forever hang over him, a reminder of the life he had destroyed in a moment of uncontrollable rage. The city of San Francisco would never forget the Verona case. It was a tale of love, lies, and betrayal, one that would serve as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind even the most beautiful of love stories. The nightmare had ended, but the pain and scars left behind would never fully heal.